what were some of the books that have been most important to you? What were they doing for you when you read them? Maybe they were
Yeah.
therapeutic in some way, or yeah.
Yeah. So I had, in a lot of reading, like, is community based, even though that, like, I pick up, like, I would never have read I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings if I didn't have someone like really push it on me. And even though we live in kind of these isolated valleys, a lot of the biggest breakthroughs I've ever had have actually come from other people. And so in eighth grade, I had this crazy teacher named Christopher Stewart, Mr. Stewart, and he was from Tennessee and had this deep Southern accent. And he'd show up to school like, he'd be partying all night and he'd wear black suits. And he had this thing called the Boys Book Club, which I don't know if that would even be allowed anymore, and biological boys only. And we would show up, and this guy would show us. We would sit, and he'd give us books. So he would. So every single week, someone would have to give a presentation on something that the CIA did like wrong, like some botched project. And then he would give us these books, and then we would watch R-rated movies. It was like it was very, very illegal. No one was watching, anyway. He was always like looking out the window. And now I'm looking back, it's like, oh man, we were doing, as a current high school teacher, like if I did that, I'd make the newspaper, I'd make the local city's Facebook group. Like, can't do that anymore. But anyway, the book, he gave me a lot of different books, but the book that turned me really on, and I recommend to a lot of people on their kind of early journey as in reading, is Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. Have you ever read that one?
No.
Yeah, so Hermann Hesse was kind of an early 20th century author. He was a modernist, and Siddhartha is kind of a fictional account of the Buddha's life. And it's really good. And Hesse is a great literary fiction author. It's not like too weird or anything. But in eighth grade, that turned me on to the East and the Eastern philosophy, because a lot of people have preconceived notions about the East in general. And maybe you've learned about it before, but, as a beginner getting into thinking and knowledge, that was big to me because a lot of us have been programmed with kind of this Western competitive, individualistic Christian mindset. And even if you want to stay in that, understanding the dyadic element, which is the East, because China and India, we're growing almost at the same pace as us at the same time. In very similar ways, because when you look at like super pagan cultures like North America and parts of Africa or even Australia and Southeast Asia, they were very much more isolated, but there was still a slight connection between Asia and the West, and seemingly we grew at the same time. So yeah,
Right.
That one really blew my mind, and that set me down like an Eastern philosophy rabbit hole that I'm still on. Another one that blew my mind and really helped me understand how to use psychedelics and open up my brain to like deeper levels of psychology. There's a guy out there. I don't know if I even recommend this book anymore. It's called Prometheus Rising by Robert Anton Wilson. And he was friends with Tim Leary and that whole crew. And it just like, he talked about how our brain's a software, and that can really open us up. And so a lot of you guys who are listening to this podcast already know all this. You have been exposed to Eastern philosophy and that stuff. But early in life, those were kind of the big pivotal books. But then at 18, speaking of like these books that you were given, Infinite Jest, I was at a store with my dad, and my dad and he talked about books with me sometimes, but I didn't really understand until later in life that he was this huge reader. And he says, oh, you got to read this book. And he gives me Infinite Jest. And apparently he read it back in the 90s. And I was actually going to mention that earlier about how writers, and you have to put yourself out there and, make, this is Ian Cadnack, this is Tom, that David Foster Wallace, in promoting Infinite Jest, the publishing house came out and they were sending out letters. That's like an underrated method. Like, I've never sent a letter before, but you open up and says, can you complete this book? Or are you smart enough to read Infinite Jest? And they send out hundreds of thousands of these things. And so speaking of the Western competitive mindset, we, people tapped into that and they're like, oh my God, like, can I do that? Can I read this? And, that really showed me the limit. So, because I was reading classic authors in these books, even Cormac McCarthy. But when I saw what someone who is kind of, kind of a little bit wonky and ADHD and really smart can do with the novel, I was like, oh my God, this is what I want to do. This is how it feels to live in the 21st century. So with fiction,
yeah, that's awesome.
I guess Prometheus Rising wasn't fiction, but yeah, those really sent me on my way and into like, further inquiry.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you spoke about the unenlightened one's journey, Siddhartha Gautama. I think that's such a common, the more I reach out to like-minded people and get to know them like yourself, the more I feel that we're very binded by that experience of growing up in the West where it's absolutely dominated by scientific empiricism of understanding like what makes the world, how the world works. But the East is so good at helping us understand how to live in the world, how to play the act of being a human being in the phenomenological experience. I think the Buddha story is amazing about finding that middle way between asceticism and self-indulgence. I took a lot from learning about the East and stuff like that as well. But we'd be remiss not to talk about DFW. We have to talk about David Foster Wallace on this show. What do you think was like? I don't know about you, man, but I tend to really, and I probably shouldn't, but I sort of can't help it. I tend to glorify the tormented artist, because I just think that there's something so profound about like a really disturbed individual who puts out this like amazing piece of art, whatever it is. Like, Vincent van Gogh was in a psychiatric institute, but he just changed the world. Even Herman Melville, Moby Dick, right? But I think the downside to it is a lot of them weren't recognized whilst they were alive. David Foster Wallace obviously was, but Vincent van Gogh wasn't, Herman Melville wasn't. Why do you think we glorify the tormented artist? Like, what do you think is going on there?
Yeah, I think an easy analogy to think about it through is like with athletics. I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen David Goggins online before. We love him. He's out there and he's punishing himself. He's telling us to push it, to go to the limits. And, but what gives him credit though is that he was a Navy SEAL. He, in a year and a half of ultra racing, finished Badwater and took third place or something. So there's a lot of people that we look up to kind of athletically, and the physical is just an easy way to like see examples. And so we love the underdog. We love the person who pushes himself for no reason. And I think that's what this tormented artist is to a lot of people, that we use it as like, when I listen to David Goggins when I'm doing kettlebells or something, to give me motivation, to pull me up. And I'm never going to do an ultra race or go as hard as he does. But I think that I feel a similar, thing when I see these tortured artists, that it's just a means of like putting myself in a trance so that I can like, at least get close to what they are doing, because yeah, a lot of us want to be that. It's unfortunate that we can't just live our own lives and stay there. But, sometimes when I'm visualizing or reading, I'm like, I can do this. Like, when I want to do this one day, like, whatever medium we're in, like, I want to feel like what it feels like to be in a concert playing music in front of a bunch of people. And sometimes, we visualize ourselves up there. And, so I think that the tormented artist, but, it could go back to something else. Have you ever heard of Otto Rank?
Yeah. Amazing psychoanalyst.
Yeah, and he has this book, Art and the Artist, Creative Personality, or the Creative Urge and Personality Development. And Rank was the protege of Sigmund Freud and was Freud's secretary, and was kind of seen as the one, not Jung, not Alder, not Wilhelm Reich or the others. It was him. And he, like the other three, broke away from Freud, but he broke away for the mythological. He saw all throughout history this idea of the tortured artist, of this person with trauma, and that the artist is inspired to create from their trauma. Ernest Becker and the Denial of Death picked up on Otto Rank and all that. But, I think there's a lot of that too, that he also wrote a book. He was also very innovative in the sense that he wrote a book called The Trauma of Birth. And now when you look at the amount of cesarean sections and mothers not breastfeeding and, negligence. That's always been in history. Honestly, mothers have died during childbirth, children have died. And so I think the trauma of birth, like, even if, your mom didn't hit you or, nothing crazy happened, I think there's also that, that easy or that unconscious, stuff with birth and the trauma there. So that's what that's his theory. And so, yeah.